Alright, so this is a walkthrough of our last chapter, which is animal behavior and ecology. It's actually multiple chapters in your book, but I've sort of summarized the most important things here. So first, you should know some basic definitions, those levels. This goes back to the beginning of the year. You'll remember cell, tissue, organ, system, organism. Ecology kind of deals with the levels above organism. So reminder from our previous chapter, a population is a group of organisms of the same species. You can have a population of deer, a population of birds, even a population of trees. A community would be all the living things in the area. So the birds plus the fish plus the algae plus the bacteria that live, everything living in that swamp. The ecosystem is all the living things, but in addition to that, the abiotic or non-living factors. So now we're including the fish and the birds and all that, but also the soil, the water, the minerals, and then finally the biosphere. So this would be our most inclusive level, and then we would get more specific as we go in this direction. Ecosystem is smaller than biosphere. Community is smaller than the ecosystem. The population is only a small component of the community, and so on. Also, just to clarify, in case anybody is iffy on the difference between an abiotic and a biotic factor, abiotic is non-living. So it's all the things in the environment that are not living things. So, for example, the temperature, the amount of sunlight, the amount of minerals that are available, the amount of water that's available, those would all be abiotic factors that could affect what could survive in a particular environment. Biotic factors also affect what can survive, because this is the organisms. So biotic factors, which we're going to talk about in a moment, would include, for example, parasites, competition, overcrowding. These are things that are because of the living organisms could also affect the ecology of a particular area. Biomes you do not have to memorize. I'm sure everybody's heard of a desert. I'm sure everybody's heard of a tropical rainforest. All you would really need to know is just be familiar with the word. A biome is an area that has a certain amount of temperature, rainfall, etc. When you think of a desert, you probably think of it being very dry. That's like the characteristic that deserts share. And honestly, depending on what book you look at, some books subdivide biomes into 12 different biomes. Others will shorten it up. But if you knew how to read a graph like this, for example, if I said that you were starting with a savanna, and some kind of climate change occurred, that the area became colder, what kind of biome might develop? And all you'd need to do is look and go, oh, well, if the environment got colder, we would expect maybe that savanna would eventually transform into a prairie. That kind of a question. So just be familiar with the word. Okay, there are also aquatic biomes, and you probably would learn more about this in, say, marine biology. Even though you've probably heard of a desert and a rainforest, you may not have ever heard of, the aphotic zone. You don't have to memorize these either, but since water covers 75% of the earth, you should be familiar with the fact that most of our oxygen actually comes from aquatic biomes, from the algae and things that live in the water. The most oxygen per square meter comes from the rainforest because there's the most living things in a short space, but the most oxygen in general actually comes from our water biomes. There are two words that you might want to be familiar with for lakes: oligotrophic and eutrophic lakes. So oligotrophic lakes, and there's a kind of an illustration on the right, an oligotrophic lake is a lake that's healthy. Even though it sounds like, from that first thing there about it having lower nutrients, it makes it sound like there's not a lot of food. But actually, an oligotrophic lake is a healthy lake because it's got the right amount of food. The water is clear, so the sun shines down. That means the plants are getting their sunlight, which means they are doing photosynthesis and releasing oxygen. So they're providing food for the organisms that eat them. They're providing oxygen for all the organisms that live in the water. And so an oligotrophic lake is actually a healthy lake. A eutrophic lake is unhealthy. It's bad. So when it says nutrient rich, it actually means that there's an overabundance of nutrients. And it doesn't sound like that would be a problem. Like, wow, how can there be too much food? But there can be. The biggest problem is nitrates and phosphates coming off from fertilizer runoff. So you have a farm, and the farmers use fertilizer, and it runs off into the lake. The problem is that's too much food. It starts to feed all the algae. So the algae start to cover the lake and make it cloudy. Well, what's going to happen when it's cloudy? The plants can't get sunlight. They can't do photosynthesis. So now they die. Now they're not making oxygen anymore, which means everybody that's relying on those plants for food and oxygen is also going to die. And so a eutrophic lake, which is often the result of pollution, is a bad lake. It's got too much food in the form of sort of fertilizer. The algae overruns it, and everything else dies because the sunlight is blocked from the bottom. This is just showing, I don't know that you need to memorize any of this, but just be aware that there's a lot of things that man does. A lot of obviously the changes in our environment are the result of things that man has done. And so there's a whole bunch of things here, just the sulfates and things that are coming out of emissions in factories. The fact that GMOs, genetically modified organisms, can get into the environment and they can compete with the native species. The GMOs are maybe bigger and they kill off the native species or they outcompete them. The overuse of antibiotics creates organisms or creates, leads to bacteria that may be antibiotic resistant. The use of pesticides and things can then lead to toxins building up in fish and things that we turn around and eat. So there's a lot of things that we do that can mess with the environment, but none of these that you have to specifically memorize. Okay, biotic factors, just to focus on them. Remember, those are the living factors that affect the environment. So I just wanted to go through a few real quick. Predation, in other words, the movement of a predator into an area might mess up an ecosystem, because if that predator is a new predator that wasn't there before and it eats all of the prey at a particular level, the ecosystem could collapse. Now there's too many plants growing and nothing to eat them. Or vice versa, you remove a predator because you think, oh, the predator is killing off all the deer, I'm going to kill off the wolves and that way the deer won't die. Well, now you have too many deer and the deer eat all the grass and the whole thing collapses. So predators and prey, that relationship is important. Herbivory is the eating of the plants. Sometimes that can be a problem. If an organism gets into an area and eats all of the plants, the ecosystem's going to collapse. They mention here sea urchins limiting the distribution of seaweed. I have that on a slide. I'll show you on the next slide. Make sure you know these are all symbiotic relationships. Most people know what parasites are. So parasitism, the plus and the minus means the parasite benefits and the host is harmed. Like a tapeworm living in your stomach. It's getting food, but it's taking the food away from you. Or a tick, that's sucking the blood. It's getting a benefit. The organism that it's living on is being harmed. Mutualism, both organisms benefit. Like the clownfish and the sea anemone live together. Both of them are benefiting from that relationship. And there's lots of examples of mutualism. The little birds that live on a rhino's back. They pick the parasites off of him, and they get protection. And the rhinoceros, is parasite-free because of the birds. Commensalism is where one benefits, and the other one, you might see a zero here, is unaffected. One example of this might be, for example, air plants that grow in the trees in my backyard. The air plants don't suck any nutrients out of the trees. They just sort of sit there. The benefit is they grow in an area where they can get more sunlight because they're growing up in the tree. But the tree is not helped or harmed, therefore this would be commensalism. And then competition is obviously another relationship. Organisms competing for food, they can sometimes keep each other in check. So these are all biotic factors. So here's some pictures. The barnacle and the whale are an example of commensalism because the barnacle, which is a filter feeder, is getting food as the whale swims through the water, but it's not harming the whale. They don't hurt the whale's fins. The whale's completely unaffected. A lichen, this picture on the left, is an algae and a fungus that live together. The fungus sort of provides the structure, and the algae lives inside of it. They grow on the side of a tree. The fungus gets food from the algae, because the algae can do photosynthesis, but the fungus then provides, like I said, the structure where the algae lives, and so this is mutualism. And then the snail, so the parasite gets into the snail, and it actually goes into the tentacles and makes them pulse. And then when the tentacles pulse, it actually attracts birds, which then eat the tentacles. Interestingly, then the bird gets the parasite. And when the bird then turns around and poops, the parasite ends up getting back into the snail when he goes over the poop. So the parasite sort of cycles back and forth between the snail and the bird. Oh, and the snail's not usually killed, by the way. The bird might eat a tentacle, but then it'll grow back. Kind of an interesting thing. This is the graph I was talking about. So this is showing how limpets and sea urchins, they both eat seaweed. But if we notice that if there's no limpets or sea urchins, you could actually have a situation where there's too much seaweed. It actually covers everything, and maybe that causes a problem. In this particular case, it looks like if you take away the urchins and you just have limpets, the seaweed stays in check. The seaweed still grows. If you just have urchins and no limpets, then basically you get no seaweed, which would collapse the ecosystem. And if you have both of them, also, it would collapse the ecosystem. So just kind of an example of just how the combinations of herbivores can affect an environment. Growth is limited in populations. They can't grow exponentially forever. There are two reasons. One reason is called density-dependent factors. These are things that limit growth specifically when it gets crowded. In other words, if there's plenty of space to go around and plenty of food, competition isn't going to be a problem. But the more babies there are and the more individuals, there's now going to start to be competition. You're going to run out of food and shelter and all that sort of stuff. Another density-dependent factor is waste accumulation, because obviously those animals are all going to the bathroom. So that has to break down. And if there's too many animals, that's going to build up and that's going to lead to diseases and things. And disease can also be a density-dependent factor, because the more crowded it is, the easier diseases spread. So these are called density-dependent factors because they specifically only come into play when it is crowded. Density-independent factors are things that can make a population decline, and they have nothing to do with, they don't only happen when it's crowded. In other words, the flood doesn't come about specifically because it's too crowded. A flood comes about when it comes about. A fire, an earthquake. These are things that would limit the size of a population, but not specifically because the population was big. These things would happen just randomly anytime. And this graph, I actually have seen this kind of graph on the AP exam, and what they did was they put both of these curves on the same graph, and they put the scale on the right for the wolf over here. So they would have these numbers, and they wanted you to read this in one graph. But the reason I show it to you is because it's kind of tricky. If you don't pay attention to the scale, you could be asked a question like, is there any time period when there's more wolves than moose? And when you look at the graph, it looks like maybe in 1980 there was more wolves because it's much higher. But the fact of the matter is that if we look at the scale, the maximum number of wolves, even in 1980, was only 50. And the amount of moose was over 1,000. So this is where you have to pay close attention to things like the scale. Also, predator and prey, they interact with each other. So you'll notice that as the moose population goes up, the wolf population goes up shortly after. Why is that? Well, because if there's more moose, there's more food. So that's probably a really good year for the wolf. And the wolves have a lot more babies because they're healthier and there's more food and there's more stuff to go around. The problem is now in the next year, there's more wolves, which means they're going to tend to eat more of the moose, so you're going to see the population of moose drop. And so this is a very common thing. They do kind of this delicate dance where the predators or the prey go up and the predators sort of follow. But as the predators go up, that makes the prey go down because they're eating more of them, which in turn makes the predators go down because there's not as much food that year. And so they tend to sort of fluctuate around each other in a healthy environment. And so that's how predator and prey can affect one another. This is just some different tactics organisms use. I would hope you'd just be familiar with the vocabulary words. Warning coloration is when an organism is brightly colored. A lot of animals will instinctually stay away from brightly colored organisms. And it makes sense because a lot of those bright colors are organisms that are toxic. Cryptic coloration is another word for camouflage. That can be used by a predator so it can ambush its prey, or by a prey so that it can obviously hide from a predator. And another common thing you might see is what's called mimicry. Mimicry is where an organism that's not harmful looks like one that is, and sometimes that'll protect it. So on the left, the brown thing is not a snake. It's actually the larva of a moth. Those black things are not eyes. They're just eye spots. I'm not even sure that's its face. It might actually be its tail end. But the bottom line is, because it looks like a snake, an organism that might eat it, a bird, might think it's a snake and stay away. And on the right side, the cuckoo bee is actually non-poisonous. It doesn't sting. But the yellow jacket obviously does. So by looking like a yellow jacket, the bee gets protected because most predators aren't going to eat it. Now this only works, just for the record, if there's more of the poisonous ones. Because if you think about it, if there's a lot of these, chances are organisms are going to start eating them and they're not going to learn that lesson that they sting. But if there's a lot of the yellow jackets and that's what the predator comes in contact with first and they get stung, they're not going to like that. They're going to make an association, don't eat yellow and black things, and now this one's going to be protected. So this sometimes only works if there's more of the actual poisonous one than the non-poisonous one, because it does require in some cases for an organism to come in contact with it one time and learn a lesson. Ouch, that bites. I'm not going to go into that one again. And so that's where we're going to stop, and I'm going to pick up with exponential growth in the next slideshow.